Hello, it's Troy Hamilton, Pioneer Sales Rep from Perth County, and you're listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast.
Thanks, Troy, and thank you for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. My name's Andrew Campbell, and we're all very excited to kick off our fourth season of this podcast with some great episodes to get you through the harvest season and to start planning for what 2023 might look like. For our first episode, we want to answer a question that isn't new for farmers, but I think still remains a bit of a mystery to many. It's around cover crops and other techniques meant to preserve soil health, reduce erosion, and build organic matter. The reason I say it isn't new is because we've all seen the talks or read the articles about cover crops, but there's still a lot of hesitation to get started because you either don't want something too complicated or don't want to mess things up for the next grain crop that needs to be planted. So we've got three great experts to help us. Andrew Verhallen is with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs as a soil management specialist. Dan Petker is a farmer in Norfolk County as well as a Pioneer rep. And Andy Van Niekerk is also a Pioneer rep, also a farmer, but in the Stayner area. Both Dan and Andy are known for their trials and expertise in trying to preserve soil health. Dan, Andy, thanks for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate being here.
So, Anne, I'm going to start the conversation with you. This is something that you've obviously studied for several years. I've been to many, crop days you've had. And I guess what I want to start this conversation is that even though this isn't a new concept, in terms of, some of these, strip tilling and cover crops and all of these types of practices, it still is not the thing that every farmer does. Why do you think that is?
That's a really good question. And it's one that we've been working on for a long time, is because we see the innovators and the early adopters have adopted it, but the large bulk of farmers are slowly taking a look at it. And why not? Probably because it complicates the system. It requires management. Sometimes I'll have people tell me it's the money, and it might be the money, but I think in a lot of cases it adds complexity, it adds risk, and it adds the need for management.
Yeah. So then if all of a sudden that does switch and somebody's interested in it, why do you think they're doing it?
Because they've seen there's a payoff and it solves a problem. It's taking care of something for them, whether it's helping to suppress herbicide-resistant weeds or providing feed. It's supplying something their system wasn't supplying before. So it's solving a problem.
So then, Dan, I want to bring you in on this part here in that, you've been doing this, you've been testing, you've been, found success and failures, I'm sure, all along the way. But if I take you back to those kind of first times you're trying it, like, why did you decide this was important to do? And what are the reasons you've found since then as to why to continue to do it?
Well, our initial reason to do it was to stop surface soil erosion. And where we saw great benefit was putting red clover into our wheat, and those fields kind of just hold together. Our other cover crops would just be oats into soybeans, and it just holds our surface soils together. And that really is our goal. We keep it super simple, so the risk of failure is quite low. And usually when it's a point of failure, it is something out of our control, like lack of rain. And you just go on from there.
Andy, same question for you. Is it soil erosion for you too, or is there a different reason why you decided this was something to do?
Part of the reason why I do it is I have hogs on my farm, so I use it to sequester nitrogen and store nitrogen attempt to store nitrogen into the next season. But so that's the reason why I got started. There's a lot of other things that soil health benefits that I have seen since. One of the first times that I had tried that was I planted oats after wheat, and completely planning on doing my fall tillage like I normally do. Winter set in early, and so I just left it. And in the springtime, just checked the field, and it had completely changed the soil surface texture. It was the fine root hairs in the oats just made so much difference to the soil texture. So I was pretty much sold after that, and that's when I started deeper into my journey.
You had those fine hairs from your oats and from your wheat, and it's amazing just putting
the
small grain window for cover crops and for soil changes. Just small grasses are amazing for that.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah.
What strikes me as what you've both talked about is, you've talked about clover, you've talked about oats. Like, neither of you have talked about anything overly complicated, big, kind of plans here. Is that one of the things that you two both do, is try to keep it simple for a reason?
If we want to introduce complexity into our cover crops, it's either we go to cereal rye, because now we got to think about spring termination. And that's as complex as we get. Like, you might throw a sunflower in there because it looks pretty, but really it's those 3 species, and I rely on them hard. Keeps it simple that way so that everyone on the farm believes, and it's not too stressful for management, and then we just go with it.
Yeah, and I have a bit more curiosity in my approach to it as well. But I do believe that if we're trying to get people started on just keep it simple, the concept of just adding it to your potash blend and blowing it on with the fertilizer applicator, and then disking it in. That's there's no different in management for the farmer in that regard. So that's the simplest way to get started. Now, I have kind of taken it a little further in doing some biostrips with different species, and I've just started that, and I just don't know whether that's going to make a difference, but it's a bit more of a pain in the butt to do it that way. So my goal is to kind of plant green, but have have a place of bare soil to plant corn into. And so that's kind of, I've introduced that complexity. I wouldn't recommend doing that sort of thing right away. I would just kind of learn as you go.
Then, Anne, based on what, Andy and Dan have talked about, kind of one's doing it more soil erosion, one's doing it more nitrogen cycling. Maybe they benefit from the other, but what are some of the other reasons that a farmer might decide that putting cover crops in, or some kind of a cover crop in, is beneficial?
Well, everybody starts off with the erosion one like Dan was talking about, but probably one of the largest uses of cover crops right now in Ontario is for dairy producers and beef producers for feed, and for beef and sheep for grazing, where they're using it as a feed source. There's a lot of dairy producers that are growing rye, taking that as a cut in the springtime, and then going back to their regular cropping system, which is a wonderful system, because that way we've got living roots in the soil 365 pretty much, and the ground is covered from the point of erosion too. Some of the other reasons why people might be using cover crops, these guys talked about structure already, but there's also the chance to suppress some of those herbicide resistant weeds. And I know Dan will probably want to talk some more about our fleabane and some of the other issues that we have coming in. And certain cover crops are better at that than others, but any cover crop where you choose the plant that's there, you're going to suppress all the weeds to a certain point. And some cover crops, of course, are better than others, like rye is better at suppressing weeds than oats, but even an oat cover crop will do a nice job.
Then just before I do want to ask that question to Dan, but I just want to stick on this theme on the feed wise. What are the most common cover crops that you see, specifically dairy and beef producers putting in, or sheep and goat producers putting out, for pastures? What are you seeing as the most common crops going in?
So a lot of dairy guys will either, a lot of them are doing rye. So after wheat or after soybeans, they'll put rye down and then take that as a first cut in the springtime. But there's a wonderful opportunity if you've got wheat in your rotation or anything that's harvested early. It could be processing peas down my way, to get oats and peas, oats and barley, those kinds of very simple mixtures, and they make either good grazing, or in the case of oats by themselves, they make great baleage.
Yeah, no question about that.
And there's been a lot of that planted this year. I see it in my area for feed.
Well, I know on our farm it's kind of the same way, that a combination of both, did the hay crop make it through a winter is always a challenge, but two, I mean, in today's environment of grain prices, how do you not try to think up ways, where you can at least plant a few more acres of beans, if there's a way to do it. So, certainly I think that sounds like the same thing that's happening in our area.
Well, to me, it's a win from a soil point of view. It's a total win, because if we've got, again, those living root systems, 365, it makes a huge difference longer term in soil structure. And we know from the research that's been done at Ridgetown, it makes a longer term difference in organic matter too.
So now, if we've talked about that, kind of soil health, you saw it, kind of right away, Andy, when you started doing this, in the soil structure. The other benefit that Anne mentioned was that suppressing weeds, Dan. What do you think its role is, especially going forward, as we, seem to just get one, more resistant weed after another?
Well, like Anne's comment about cereal rye being quite strong, here in Norfolk County, cereal rye has been used as a cover crop for decades.
Yes.
And what you see now, where some of our friends and growers are using new species, we are seeing fleabane come through where we use, let's say, barley or buckwheat or some of these big elaborate mixes. But when you put just a straight cover crop of rye, it suppresses Canada fleabane like you wouldn't believe, like as if it was a massive herbicide pass. You will see that difference the following year, like all season long. So now fleabane is dealt with in a nice, easy, economic way. As water hemp comes forward, we have to find what species interacts and suppresses pigweeds quite well. Again, it'd be something aggressive like cereal rye, or clover. Actually, we'll see red clover suppressing weeds remarkably well, just because it is so aggressive where it establishes well. It
just canopies so quickly.
That's it. So fast growing ones. So really, especially when we see water hemp with 4 modes of action, resistance to 4 modes of action, it's some of these choices to me are a no-brainer. It's just how do you integrate them into the system we're operating on.
Have you found the same thing up your way, Andy?
Actually, we're quite a lot farther north. We don't have that kind of pressure. There's on the south end of our county, we're experiencing Roundup-resistant fleabane, but not necessarily on the north part. So it isn't as much of a problem, especially not water hemp. But we do have it. It's not as rampant. Hopefully, we've learned from fellows like Dan who've had to deal with it for a while. So, but no, we're not as pressured up here, Andrew.
So then, if we look at this, okay, we've got some reasons why, and maybe you can kind of start this part of the conversation off in terms of, okay, how does a grower with maybe just only a little bit of experience or no experience with cover crops, how would they get started?
Well, if they're just getting started, I'd recommend that they take the time to think about how it's going to fit in their system. Take the opportunity to look at some of the resources that are out there. There's a ton of webinars. Usually our ag conferences cover some cover crop topics, and that may introduce them to some other people. The other thing is look around in your neighborhood. In every neighborhood, there's somebody who's been doing cover crops, usually for a while. And there's some more earlier or more newer growers trying cover crops. Get talking to some of your neighbors.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Watch what they're doing, because most people are pretty generous in their time and their honesty in what's worked and what hasn't worked. And some of that cover crop management is very production system specific, but also region specific. Like what works in Dan's area isn't necessarily going to be as easy to make work in Andy's area. And I've certainly found that being down around the Ridgetown area, that we've got a much longer season in the fall. We can get away with planting a lot of things a lot later than many people in the rest of the province.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense to chat with your neighbors. The other part that you can take a look at is, and Ontario is part of the Midwest Cover Crop Council. So we've got a website. It's got a decision tool that you can get a ton of information about what is suitable. It's backed up by long-term weather data on Ontario, and it's done county by county. And also within that, there's a series of cover crop recipes. And these are get started type of recipes that walk you through how does it fit in your system and things to think about. And if you don't like the Ontario recipes, there's Michigan, Ohio, Minnesota, Wisconsin, all other states that are surrounding us that are fairly comparable to lots of the areas in Ontario. So there's lots of information out there if you look for it.
And it does sound like a good place to, if you are curious, what should I be planting when? I think that might be one of the holdups all the time is that, well, I don't know when, and I don't want to have it run into be an issue when I go to plant or whatever like that maybe a guide like that does help quite a bit.
The other thing that can help, and we do have some of this on the OMAFRA website, is a seed supplier list. Because that's often the question I get is, so I want to plant this. Where can I get the seed? If you stick with the simple, that's usually not too hard to find things like oats and rye and barley. But if you're starting to look at more complicated things, then sometimes you have to look a little farther afield.
Now, Anne, you did mention, folks are usually pretty generous with their time when you have questions. Case in point, we've got Andy and Dan who we asked, would you be generous with your time to help us? And it does work well. And that's where, like Andy, from your perspective, you have both of you have a lot of these conversations, but starting with you, Andy, like when you are talking to growers who are kind of in this, for the first or second or third year, what are some of the big kind of questions they have? And what are a few of the lessons that you usually give them?
Always, if they're starting out, just keep it simple. Start with your retailer. If just blow it on with the, as I mentioned before, blow it on with the fertilizer, and just keep it simple and learn as you go. And that's kind of how I would advise people. Ironically, we had the Skulls and Crops Association in our area have been doing a few tours on that type of on crop cover crops as well. We hosted one at our farm the other month, and so those are all good places to start there too. But yeah, keep it simple initially and learn as you go.
Yeah, and don't get discouraged.
Yeah.
I'm a huge proponent of red clover into wheat fields, but that means a grower has to be willing to grow wheat, which is rare in a lot of places. But red clover has been a primary cover crop in Ontario for ever.
Eons, yeah.
And to me, that one, even if it's a partial stand, I don't get discouraged because it's something there holding our soils or penetrating hard pans or just, don't let the small failures get in the way. And then the big ones are just something, their direction to find solutions. That's all. It's not like a way to stop or meaning to stop.
Yeah. The other concept you have to think about, I guess, is how it's going to be terminated. Like start with the end in mind and determine how it's going. If it's a winter kill, if it's just oats, then you don't have to worry about it.
If I look at myself, one of the holdups is, while I don't want to put something in that's going to mess up the beans that I put in after, which, yeah, sure, an extra spray might fix, but, if you don't get in on time or whatever, it's a problem. So, I mean, where do people go for that information to find out, what am I going to do? What is the best crop for me? Is it, again, as I say, the Midwest Cover Crop Tool? Is it, your Pioneer rep? Who is that?
As Ann had mentioned earlier, that like there are regional differences, and I think seeking out somebody in your neighborhood that's doing it already, and I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah.
Pioneer reps are in the neighborhoods, and I happen to be one that's growing cover crops. Not all of them are, but a lot of them are aware of where to start.
Yeah, rely on your peers.
Yeah,
Agreed,
Dan.
And if there's a lot of us farmers, we understand which plants will die over winter. So oats is one. So if we're concerned about what it's going to be like in the spring, well, you plant something that dies fast and disappears fast, which is oats. There.
Mm-hmm.
And then you just
most years,
that is true.
Most years,
yeah,
because that is a regional difference.
Yeah. So in the south, like Chatham, Kent, it'll be different than where here in Norfolk, or as if we go to Grey Bruce or even Ottawa.
Yeah, and there've been a few other things that have provided some entertainment in the spring because they haven't died when they're supposed to, thanks to climate change, maybe. I always like to have a plan B. You have your plan A for termination and your backup.
But see, then that introduces complexity of, well, a little bit. Like it's still a simple decision process, right? Winter killed it, yes or no? If no, then what? And typically that answer is glyphosate. So it's just a two-step simple process.
Sure. Yeah, but in most systems, you're going to have a kill step coming in anyways.
Yeah, exactly right. It's just part of the thing, part of the production.
You know what? I really like that roadmap you've provided, Dan, in terms of like, okay, does winter kill it? Yes or no? Go to step 2 if no, and make that plan, because it is one of those things where I think in conversations that I've had is it's almost that, well, I don't need another job, but if all of a sudden we're talking about throwing it in with a fertilizer and then letting Mother Nature deal with it, seems like a pretty easy and straightforward place to start.
Yeah, and the nice part is a lot of retailers now will willingly blend, let's say, potash with oats or potash with cereal rye. At least down here, just because it is.
Yeah, and they do it up here too, Dan. And
yeah, it's very common now for guys to do that.
Absolutely.
So then just before we do wrap up, I'm just kind of curious about, you mentioned, I think it was you, Dan, a little earlier on about, some of those kind of, not being afraid to necessarily, make a mistake. But I guess I'm kind of curious if we could prevent a couple of those. What do you think are a couple of the kind of early mistakes that people make when they are getting into this?
They go too complex or they jump into the deep end too soon.
Yes.
It's a mistake we made when annual ryegrass was a big deal. Thankfully, it's not anymore. But we played with all kinds of that and wanted to plant green and put soybeans in there. And the rye got away on us, and it's still in the field. So get excited about the hype about certain things, but you got to step your way there before you practice them on your own farm. Don't go too deep.
Agreed.
It's kind of like,
Is that the same you found in your area, Andy?
Yes, just keep it simple and learn as you go, and find out what works in your area, and just keep the complexity down for initially, and just do it. If you make a mistake, just do it the next year and learn from that experience. Each year is an experience.
What about you, Ann? Like in terms of you get the provincial outlook here and even into the Midwest. What have you seen? Okay,
one of my bugaboos though is not paying attention to what your seeding rate is. And that still comes back to what's your why? Why are you planting it? If you're planting it for feed, you're going to use a feed rate. So it's going to be heavy because you want a lot of biomass to come off. But if you're just looking for a simple cover, just to do some better soil management, reduce erosion, you're probably not looking at those really high rates. And it's a lot easier to deal with if it's a light rate and things go wrong than if it's really heavy.
I agree. And, 40 pounds of cereal rye drilled in the fall is just an amazing. You can plant a lot of acres with one tank, and that's all you need. is 40 pounds really.
Yep. Well, I have a friend who they run an RTS over every single one of their acres in the fall, like post soybeans and corn harvest, and they put 30 pounds of rye down, like basically a bushel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And come springtime, their fields are beautiful. They strip till into it. They spray it off with their burn down passes anyways in the springtime, and nice and simple. And their crops and their fields look amazing.
Yeah, so that became part of the system, though, right?
Yeah, exactly that.
As part of their cropping system.
Yeah.
And that I think is really important, is figuring out how does it fit? Because at least the research that we've got right now and what's been done in the States has shown that the guys who are really successful with cover crops have adjusted the seeding rates. They know their termination. They fitted it into their process, just like Andy was talking about with applying it with the fertilizer. So they're sharing costs, sharing operations. So it is it's embedded in the system. It's not an afterthought.
Well, whether it's about, keeping it simple, as you've all mentioned, whether it's about knowing what the why is, what the reason you want to do it is, or whether it's just, kind of picking up the phone or reaching out to folks like Andy, Dan, Ann, who have been in this game for a long time. It seems like a pretty straightforward path. So I really appreciate the three of you helping the rest of us walk through this kind of, baby steps as a lot of others get going. So thanks very much, guys.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
On our next episode, we take a big picture look at all that's happened to bring grain yields to what they are today. Is it because of the research that's invested in new hybrids, or is it because of all the things we've learned in how to manage a crop? Or is it both? We'll cover that next time. On behalf of myself and the entire team working behind the scenes on this, thanks so much for listening. Don't forget, you can always get in touch on Twitter at Pioneer Seeds CA or my personal handle, Fresh Air Farmer. And for more information or advice, talk to your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.